Welcome to Energy Stew. This is Peter Roth, your host, and I'd like to ask you, how are all your shadows doing? Are they having fun? Or is it terrible? What kind of life do we have living with shadow or shadows? And to help us know how to live better with them is the author of an amazing book that everybody should own because it really helps us find our way. It's called Shadow Work for the Soul, Seeing Beauty in the Dark. We're going to look at that. So welcome to Energy Stew, Mary Shutan. Welcome. I'm so glad to
Thank,
talk with you.
thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be here.
Thank you. And obviously, shadows are a big part of not probably of your life too, because you wouldn't be writing about it if you weren't managing your own.
They certainly have been at the beginning stages of, when I was looking, searching spiritually. I found, all of this really light work stuff, and I resonated more with things like shamanism and shadow work and, kind of digging within the self. So I definitely have had a slightly different path than some others, and certainly have had some shadows, yes.
Yes, well, we all do because we were once children with parents. No matter how well-meaning or not our parents were, we definitely needed to mold ourselves accordingly. And the way we're molded might not be honest to ourselves.
Yeah, that's incredibly good point. People are talking a lot about trauma these days, which is wonderful, but somebody can have a really healthy childhood and still have shadows and things to look at because there are still ways things that they learned in their childhood home, ways of being that they learned that changed them and shifted them in some way. So
Right.
all of us could stand to look at our shadows.
But we're not our parents, we're not born to have their personalities. We each have our own. And so often parents try to guide us through what they see as correct for themselves, and they want us to be as smart as they are. And we might be different.
Exactly. That happened to me, and it's happened to so many people that I know that they were on a bit of a different wavelength than perhaps the rest of their family. And so in adulthood, it's interesting to sort of puzzle that out.
Right, because as as children, the world is seen through our parents. They're kind of like the guideposts of life. And so we learn to mold ourselves as as these role models are showing us, and in ways that we're not always comfortable with, but we think that that's how we are going to succeed in this big world out there that are just like our parents, apparently, to our young eyes.
Yeah, one really important concept to understand is that as we're going through stages of development when we're a child, we really do, our brains sort of grab onto the thought that our household, our childhood home, really is the world or even the universe. And so what we believe to be true about the world very much comes from our childhood home.
Right. And so how do we discover ourselves? For instance, when I was young, I grew up in a family of artists, and art was God. And if you were worthy, art was your God too. And so I thought that I was supposed to become an artist and fit in with the family that way and make art God. And it just didn't work. I wasn't good enough for that as an artist. And I was here to do other things. But it got awkward because I, I, I wasn't happy that I couldn't live up to the family art world.
Yeah, and that's so incredibly common, where parents want for us to either be in their image or their sort of crafted ideal about what a successful child would be, like a doctor, lawyer, that sort of concept. And so it could easily be a child growing up in a household of artists, who isn't artistic in that way. Or it could be a child who grows up in a family full of, accountants who has no interest or talent in numbers. Or it can come from a culture or home in which you don't have a real job unless you are, doctor, lawyer, something like that.
But I remember a client coming to me one time who was a highly Orthodox Jew who studied all the time, this man. And his son was coming of age, and he wanted him to appreciate that his life was going to be all about study. And his son didn't want that. And he came to me and said, what am I going to do? He needs to develop this trait of just being dedicated to study. And I looked at this, kid, and he was really into industry and all kinds of business and even trucks and things that didn't have to do with his father. And poor kid. I mean, I don't know what happened next, but his father at least understood from me that his son wasn't designed for study. And I'm guessing in those communities, that's really not good.
Yeah, that definitely happens quite a bit, or if somebody has, a talent for being a chef, or that's like what their calling is inwardly. And so, according to their parents, then they might be, at worst disowned, but, maybe just passive aggressively talked about or something like that. Or maybe in some families there might be a bit of turmoil, but then eventually there can be some measure of acceptance. But it can definitely be a journey for parents and child to get to that point if it's not part of, kind of their ideals or their thoughts about what and who they want their child to be.
So in many ways, we're trying to fit in the world and grasping for whatever reality feels that it can work for us. And yet there's that inner urge to be true to ourselves that might be different from everybody else. And then there's probably a lot of guilt and shame that we can't do that. And we, start wearing masks and uh, maybe need to fake it. But then, so when we cut off parts of ourselves, uh, where does that leave us in terms of fulfilling our life?
We cut off parts of ourselves when, those parts don't meet approval. So this might be explicit, like somebody telling a child, oh, you're too much. And that might be enthusiasm, joy, curiosity. We've all probably been around kids that have asked, why is the sky blue? And, questions like that that eventually annoy their parents. Um, and so we cut off these aspects of ourselves, both that might be kind of our shadows of light. So these really positive, wonderful, joyful aspects of ourselves. And we also cut off parts of ourselves that do not meet the approval of our parents and, kind of the early education systems that we're in. And so what happens with all of that is that we cut off parts of our vitality, essentially. We learn to wear masks. We learn to, become less than who we are. We learn to continually worry about approval, and being liked and belonging with others. And so Robert Bly in his book on the shadow, he talks about like by the time that we reach adulthood, we have this long bag that we carry behind us, and we're a mirror sort of shadow of who we once were, because in that long bag are all the parts of us that we've learned are not good enough or not morally correct or not okay according to our families and schools along the way.
It's interesting. So what I'm feeling is that so many of us who are proud of ourselves and are living in the light of our families or in the light of, what's considered good in the world is actually living a phony life. We're so happy. Look how happy we are being who we've adjusted ourselves to be, rather than who we really would like to be if we didn't hide from them.
Yeah, and a lot of times we are given, this conditioning not only by our parents, not only by our schools, but religion, culture about what we are supposed to value, what is supposed to make us feel fulfilled and happy. And a lot of it for us in the West very much centers around career, around material possessions, um, around, what type of house, how many children we have, stuff like that. And so a lot of times we do these things or try to achieve these things without even really considering if we want them or not.
Well, we do want them in order to be approved.
Yeah, but if that wasn't sort of like the, sword of Damocles above our heads, like would we want children? Would we want a house? Would we want to be in this career or that? Would we want this type of car? Those are all questions that when somebody really does shadow work, they can kind of come out of the shadow of all of that social cultural conditioning and consider on an individual level what provides meaning for them, what would let their soul flourish along with practical stuff, keeping themselves fed and, all that sort of good stuff. But a big chunk of shadow work is really that what's called an individuation process, which is considering what we think on an individual level rather than the thoughts that we've sort of been given.
Right. And it can be shocking. We get into like what some often is a midlife crisis,
Yeah.
and we want to give up what we've been successful at because it just doesn't feel right anymore. And now what? And I know a man who was very successful in marketing, had his own, with his wife, had their own marketing company. They international, it was very good. And one day he just said, I have to stop working and I have to go move in with the needy people in the world and care for them and give up all my material wealth and just kind of be a monk. And it was like shocking that he wanted such a change, but that's who he was really meant to be, even though he was successful at being somebody else. And his wife needed to adjust to that, of course, and did in her own way, and made a big contribution to society. Um, and so we don't know. All of a sudden, we might have that urge to be who we needed to be in the first place, but didn't allow it to happen.
Yeah, and just bring in exactly your point in a different way. I've had friends who grew up in families of creatives and artists, and their big sort of recognition or awakening was, going to become a physician, or, going to become something that's kind of considered more sort of standard for our world, which was in, kind of defiance of the messaging of their household.
Yeah, and for me, it was kind of awkward that art wasn't God anymore, and
Yeah.
that I shouldn't aspire to make it so. And I needed to find my own path. And I look back, I just actually what it is I look back with personal guilt that I allowed myself to not be true to myself. And not that I knew how to be, because after all, I was following the family God. And that I lost all the part of my life trying to be who I wasn't. And it feels awkward. And I guess, and you talk about in the book about what we shouldn't bypass about it. We shouldn't um, try to forgive it and move on, but rather just see it as uh, who we needed to be then. And maybe actually we can lighten the shadow by seeing that we didn't, um, we weren't as victimized as, because maybe that it needed to be. Maybe we needed to dance in our shadows for a while and then find out that, you know, we're on false ground. And then when we move on, maybe find some compassion for ourselves and love for ourselves to live in a world that we struggle like that, and find the richness in that.
Yeah, I work with and I'm in contact with a lot of people who've undergone spiritual awakening processes or have gone through kind of massive healings where there has been this enormous, death and rebirth process where they're, not who they were, sometimes 5 minutes ago, sometimes 5 years ago. And a lot of people want to move into that new terrain right away, but they're kind of stuck. And the reason that they're stuck is that they're trying to bypass the grief and the disappointment that they are rightfully experiencing at kind of the death of their old selves, like the death of their old dreams, the death of their old identities, stuff like that. And in order for them to sort of move on into a place of compassion and forgiveness and all that sort of really great stuff, there needs to be that grieving process, that space to really be like, okay, I have a right to feel grief, depression, anger, whatever I'm feeling, and to give permission to feel that. And with that, it lets people kind of move on into that new
And,
self.
yeah, and how about loving the richness of that, um, or at least accepting the richness of that? Because I'm thinking of loss and grief, and I've lost a number of dear people in my life, uh, not quite a number of times. And I remember one time I was in deep grief, loss of a 14-year-old cousin who died suddenly, and and people saying, "Oh, we'll help you feel better. You know, can we do some healing for you?" And I said, "No, no, I really need to be in grief. I need to be in this richness of the experience of it, because it actually holds me closer to my cousin who passed, is to stay in that grief, not try to bypass it."
Yeah, and so I talk about bypassing in the book, and I also talk about emotional intelligence tools because a lot of us don't know how to feel our emotions. A lot of us don't know that it's okay to feel them, and tools to really be okay with feeling them in a safe way. Um, And so what you learn through doing shadow work is that we have such a tendency to want to move on and to want to like bypass things just simply to sort of feel better, to not feel that suffering. But if we're able to feel the grief, if we're able to feel the really dark stuff, what emerges out of that is its opposite. And this is so hard to describe unless people have experienced it. But for example, in the grief of losing a loved one, if we really let ourselves experience that, um, great love, emerges. That sort of richness includes, um, includes its opposite, includes its light as well.
Yes, yes. And I think that's what we should look at for all shadows, is that they do hold light because they move us forward. Identifying the shadows move us forward, because then we see what we're afraid of who not wanting to be, and um, and then if we can accept that we have been living in a shadow and be able to move on from it, it actually makes us better people because of that recognition.
It does. So a lot of shadow work is about accepting and having compassion for parts of ourselves. So even the really dark parts of ourselves, even things like our anger or inner witch or inner tyrant, all of these parts of ourselves, if we can accept them as a part of ourselves, we're no longer cut off from them. And what happens is that we become more whole, first of all. We become more realized, but also we start to have more control over them. We can make conscious decisions about them. Um, when we cut parts of ourselves off, they're outside of our conscious control. For example, if we've cut ourselves off from feeling our anger because anger isn't light or anger is bad or anger is scary, what happens is that anger will just erupt out of us randomly. What happens when we can welcome our anger and know that we have a right to feel it is that when we feel angry, we can decide how we want to wield that anger. Do we want to scream at somebody? Do we want to punch somebody? Do we want to go for a walk? Do we want to meditate? One of my favorite angry activities is vacuuming. Those are all choices to us when they weren't previously.
Right. I used to, when I was a serious long distance runner, I used to get through emotions by pounding the pavement.
Yeah, perfect. Perfect way to work with your shadow. Yeah.
Right. And so that's important for us to have different ways that we surrender to our shadows as um, part of the path that we're on in life, that we um, I don't mean give into the shadows so much as accept them and then find ways of changing ourselves to not be so swallowed up by the shadow and becoming a better what we feel is a better person for ourselves that way. So and there's so many. I mean, we can talk about how we identify our shadows in ways that we don't always think about it. Like, for instance, people we see out there misbehaving, and we become enraged at that. I mean, there are some times when it's very righteous to be angry at misbehavior, but there are times when there are just people who are, or you complain about and say, "Oh, I don't like that behavior in that person," and then the people will say to you, "Yeah, but you behave that way too," and that's what
Yeah.
we can identify.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I talk about it in the book, is that one of the big ways we can identify our shadows is by looking at what we claim in others. And so we have a tendency to claim the same thing in other people a lot, that is something we're likely blind to, or is a shadow within ourselves that we could stand to look at.
Right. And not necessarily like about ourselves.
Yeah, and the purpose isn't to be like really excited that we get, I don't know, road rage or whatever it is. It is to um, accept that that is part of who we are. And when we're able to do that, the blind spot disappears, and all of that moral righteousness that and all of that projection we tend to do to deny parts of ourselves disappears. We'll
Yeah.
generally have an easier time of it with the world.
So I'm thinking of collecting shadows and putting them on the table and being able to look at them and go, okay, this shadow I'm having trouble with, and this other shadow I can accept more. And this other shadow, my gosh, that's making me into a better person. So I'm going to let it push me, keep pushing me, and it pushes me to be better for it.
Yeah, it seems so strange to say, but like, really integrating or accepting these shadow parts in yourself, like, oh yeah, I guess I can be a jerk sometimes, or or an idiot sometimes, or whatever you're noticing in others. It really does make you a more aware person. It makes you a more, realized person. It makes you um a I guess I would say a better person, but there's a lot to talk about in terms of like our conceptions of morality. But I'll just say yes, a better person.
Right. And that's so important to see ourselves growing through our shadows. So it's so important. So let's look at the book again, The Shadow Work for the Soul, Seeing Beauty in the Dark. And you are Mary Shutan. How can people find out about you more?
They can go to my website, maryshutan.com. I'm also on Facebook and Instagram, so on social media as well.
Great, because I think a lot of people should really be challenging themselves to appreciate their shadows. And I think our shadows make us into better people. And so I'm in favor of them.
I am as well.
That's great. So, Mary, thank you so much for being a guest in Energy Stew. It's so wonderful to talk with you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me.
And this is Peter Roth, your host of Energy Stew at prn.live. I can be reached at peter@heartriver, HEART, river.org. And I'd love to hear from you. Thanks so much for listening.